Jackson, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, Tim, thanks for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. I've been wanting to talk to you for a while, so I'm glad this has worked out. Well, let's talk about the current global energy picture. Tell us, Professor, what are you seeing and what are some of the trends that you're witnessing?
Yeah, so I think we've had a bit of disruption over the last year, which was unprecedented. But if we look at kind of on a larger scale, the trends are pretty clear. I mean, over the last 100 years, the world population has been growing, and also world GDP is growing. We're producing, the economy is producing more and more things, and we're using more energy to do so. So as developing countries are getting richer, there's more demand for transportation, for electricity. So overall energy production and demand has been going up, and with that, on one hand, there's a lot of benefits to energy. Brings us a lot of comfort, and a lot of wealth in a lot of cases. So some of that is really good news to see, an increase in energy use over time. But some of the challenges are that, as we use more and more energy, a lot of our energy sources, such as oil and coal, for example, create a lot of pollution as a byproduct. And one thing that we've been concerned about recently is the climate change impacts. Whenever we burn these fossil fuels, we're emitting more carbon into the atmosphere. And the planet is going to get warmer over time as a result of that. And we may see other changes to our normal weather patterns as a result. Going back to COVID-19, on one hand, we saw the economy really slow down dramatically during COVID-19. But if you look at emissions trends, you might think, well, okay, how much did we clean up? And it turns out that emissions only went down about 6%. So they went down for the first time in decades, but that kind of underscores the challenge of how difficult it's going to be to clean up that pollution, given how big that disruption is. And it only led to a 6% reduction in how much carbon we emitted last year.
And Jackson, that's a global number, not a domestic number?
Yeah, so at the global scale.
Wow, I would have hoped for double digits.
Yeah, I would have thought it would have been bigger, but 6% is how much emissions went down from 2019 to 2020.
Yeah, thanks. So when you think about the impact that clean, and let's just call it dirty, energy has on the environment, what about the global landscape as far as which countries, policies are working, and where are you seeing a decrease in this number, the emission number, and maybe some of the bright spots, and then some of maybe the rest of us who aren't doing so well?
I think that there's been kind of a broad range of responses. I think almost every country is talking about it and thinking about it. But one of the big, so let me just talk a little bit about one of the reasons why this problem is difficult to solve at a country level. So basically, the climate is a function of how much all countries are emitting into the atmosphere, and it doesn't really matter where it comes from. It's going to spread out into our atmosphere and have an effect on everyone. And each country is kind of a small part of the big world. So, the US is a pretty big part, but even the US, is less than 25% of total emissions. So even if the US cleans up a lot, there's still going to be quite a lot of carbon emissions left. So you really need every country to chip in to solve the problem. And you have, if you look at to see like which countries are doing well, I mean, I don't think anyone's hitting it out of the park right now, I would say. But if you do look at like the US or Europe or some of the more developed countries, emissions have been staying flat or declining slightly. So we have been able to clean up a little bit, but not dramatically. Now, and if you look at kind of developing countries, some of the larger ones like India or China, their emissions have been going up very dramatically. Part of that is just a function of they're in a different part of their development cycle. The US had a large increase in pollution during earlier decades and air pollution and other things as we were getting wealthier. And over time, we got wealthier and we wanted to clean up some of our air and water pollution, and there was more demand. But when you're not as wealthy, it can be difficult to prioritize those long-term environmental goals when you're just trying to put food on your family's table. In which case, you're going to want to take the cheapest energy source available. And I don't think anyone's at fault for wanting to do that or wanting to live, a middle-class lifestyle. So those are some of the challenges involved. I think that there are some key policies that we should focus on if we want to solve this problem. So one of the key things is that right now, fossil fuels are too cheap. And what do I mean when I say that they're too cheap? When we burn fossil fuels, we get benefits, which are great, driving our car around, going on vacation, enjoying, different products that we do on the day-to-day basis. But we also create this pollution that's having a negative effect on other people. And right now, firms, consumers, and even countries are not really paying the full cost of that pollution. So good policy should try to increase the price of those goods that are creating what economists call pollution externalities. The second challenge is that right now there's not enough incentive for innovation. And so what do I mean by that? Let's say that a company comes up with a revolutionary new product. It could be an electric car, brand new technology that hasn't been utilized very much, but it allows better performance, potentially better acceleration than old cars, and also creates less pollution. Well, that company is going to make some profits from developing that product, but you could argue that they're not going to make enough profits. And the reason is that a lot of other companies will learn from that product. Companies will see that product and they will build other cars or improve on that technology. And so in that sense, we don't have enough incentive to innovate new technologies. So one thing that policymakers should be focusing on is giving funding and incentives for research and innovation and development in new technologies.
Sure, that certainly makes sense. And I could see it being very difficult because you're also doing that in real time, right? And so I read that, Norway's electric vehicle sales outpaced the fossil fuel vehicle sales in 2020. So they grabbed more than, I think it was 54% of the market share. And then they're working towards all vehicles being sold being electric by 2025. Now that's a lofty goal, but we know that Norway is a very wealthy country and a small one when compared to many of the populations across the globe. I think they're just over 5 million. So it speaks to what you're sharing with us about population being part of what's happening now. How about thinking of it?
Can I just
Yeah,
hop in on that?
of course.
So I think that this is kind of a good example of where there may be some, and I should preface this by saying we don't totally understand all these factors, but I do think that there's a lot of promise here. But I think that somewhere like Norway is a small country that is a very small part of overall carbon emissions. So they could turn their carbon emissions to zero, say they totally clean up. It's not really going to make that big of a difference on a global scale. But say Norway puts all of this funding and policy effort into developing electric vehicles and rolling out electric vehicles. Well, they're wealthy and potentially they're willing to pay for these vehicles when the technology hasn't been fully developed and kind of been thought out to played out over decades, essentially. So when new technologies start, they're typically expensive. But the potential benefits there is that if Norway and other developed countries emphasize these technologies and put a lot of effort into developing them, we hopefully will get better at building them over time. And if we are able to build up the technology well enough and we're able to make it cheap enough, then at the end game, hopefully you have a technology that's now cheap enough that less wealthy countries may be able to benefit from that technology, adopt it as well, even if it's later on, and then everyone can get some benefits from that. And that would be kind of an example of how innovation might be able be something that could spill over to other countries.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jackson. I was thinking too on the energy side. I know you've done some research in that area and looking at solar adoption. Our neighborhood has more than 100 homes in it, and I know we're now to 5 of the 100 some odd homes have added solar panels to their roofs. And in the discussions with those I know who've made that choice, like you and myself, are very concerned to contribute in a positive way to bring numbers down. What are you seeing more broadly with some of the adoption with solar energy, both domestically in the private sector? I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so solar, it has been a really big success story, I would say, in terms of innovation. And I think it's something we hope to replicate with the electric vehicle. So if you looked at solar 20 years ago, there was basically none. There might have been like a few little panels here and there, but this technology was basically non-existent. And it was extremely expensive to produce. And over the last decade, it's gone from nothing to being now the largest capacity additions of any new power plants we're building in the US. And in some places like Germany, it's also become the most common new technology that's being installed today. And the costs have gone down dramatically, like over 100 times cheaper than it was 20 years ago. There's a couple factors that have contributed. So one is that we've had, in some areas, we've had aggressive public policy trying to advocate for it. So the US government has offered a 30% tax credit for solar investments for a while. And some states have offered other incentives. Indiana is not particularly generous on the incentives. And so that's one reason why, in Bloomington, you see a bit more, but at the state level, there's not a ton of solar. Another reason is we are not the sunniest state either. So one key factor that's driven the solar uptake is that it's gotten cheaper. Policymakers have subsidized it. And then my research has also examined ways that we can make the market more efficient. So this is kind of a new technology. A lot of times with new technologies, you may not, it may be difficult for buyers to find sellers. They may not know where to look. So I've done some research looking about how we can use the internet and new platform technologies to better connect buyers with solar installers, which in my work I found to really reduce the price that consumers pay and lead to a lot more adoptions compared to a world where you don't have that ability to easily connect buyers and sellers.
Yeah, well, great. I hope that the research goes forward, as my colleague likes to say, and helps inform the public to be prepared to make better decisions for themselves and have the access and be able to adopt the technology to their benefit and, let's face it, to the world's benefit, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I think, there's a lot of, I think when you look at this area, there's definitely some things that can make you feel optimistic. But as I mentioned before, it is a very challenging problem. So even, kind of small increases, they're promising, but there's still kind of quite a lot of work to be done, I would say.
So any advice for us, Jackson? How might we accelerate that work, and what else could we be doing, you think, to, is it more an awareness issue, or I guess that could lead to a lot of different questions, but I'll just leave it to you. What advice would you say to really help us better understand maybe the urgency of these issues?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's urgent. I'm an economist, so my view is that the way to solve this is to get the incentives right. And right now the incentives are not right. So, as I've highlighted before, energy is not inherently bad. Oil is not inherently bad. It's just we don't want to create this pollution. And so we need to get those incentives right. And just to highlight what I said earlier, one way to do that is to make firms and consumers pay a tax or pay a fee when they pollute. That doesn't mean that you necessarily have to get rid of oil if you find a way to capture the pollution. And then the other thing is giving incentives for this research and development, which right now there's not an incentive for enough research and development because of some of these spillovers. So I think that getting those incentives right are important. I think, I'd like to say that if everyone was just educated, that we would all just clean up, but I'm a little bit more pessimistic on that. And I think that we are going to need policy and, on a large scale, both in the US and other countries cooperating. There's a lot of challenges involved, but I think it comes down to getting those incentives right.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And perhaps coming out of this global pandemic, now that we've worked a little more collectively, right, to address this ongoing disruption, maybe we move on to the next one and start to address some of the concerns. And I do believe, I like so much what you said about, everyone needs to contribute, because unless it's not at that scale, right, we're not going to have the impact that's needed to offset the growing concern, which is carbon emissions, certainly. Well, Jackson, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us today and And thank you so much for your time and your thought leadership. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, Tim. It was really good chatting with you again.
Thanks. Take care.